He's an award-winning biographer. He's award-winning biographer, and he's one of my favorite writers. And because written so much about Black history and Black heroes, I thought he'd be a great person to celebrate Black History Month with. Then when I reached out to Wil, he told me about his new book, his new forthcoming book, Colorization, 100 Years of Black Films in a White World. And I was even more excited about talking with him. So today, Wil and I are going to talk about Black heroes, Black history, Black films. I want to introduce Wil. Wil Haygood is the Broadway Distinguished Scholar in Residence in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Miami University in Ohio. I read my way into opportunity. The more I read, the more I realized the world was big and I could find a place in it. That is what Wil Haygood told me about how reading and writing shaped him as a young person when I interviewed him for my book, The Word, Black Writers on the Transformational Power of Reading and Writing. Wil became a writer whose books have inspired the same realization that the world is big and you can find your place in it in readers all over the world. In 1984, he became a staff writer at the Boston Globe, where he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and remained there for several years before becoming a writer for the Washington Post in 2002. As an investigative reporter, he's traveled all over the world, including France, Germany, India, South Africa, where he witnessed Nelson Mandela's liberation, and Somalia, where he was kidnapped and ransomed by rebels. In 2008, during his time at the Post, he wrote his article, A Butler Well Served by This Election, which became the basis for the 2013 award-winning motion picture, The Butler, directed by Lee Daniels and starring Oprah Winfrey and Forest Whitaker. Wil is the author of 12 books, which range from memoir to biography to a book about the visual art culture of the Harlem Renaissance. Today, we're going to talk about his biographies. He's the award-winning biographer of books about Adam Clayton Powell, Sammy Davis Jr., Thurgood Marshall, and Sugar Ray Robinson. After we talk a little bit about the biographies, we will then move into a discussion of his book, Colorization. And also, I hope we'll have time for Wil to give some advice to those of you in the audience who are emerging writers who want to become who he has become. And once again, I want to welcome everybody on Zoom. I want to welcome everybody on Facebook. My tech person, Ramona, will be posting information in the chat room on Zoom and in the comments section on Facebook that will allow you to pre-order Colorization as well as get on my listserv. So Wil, thank you. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad to have you. I want to start by talking about these heroic men that you wrote your biographies about. And you said that you chose them because they were crossover rebels. And I'd like to just take them kind of one at a time and have you talk briefly about why they are crossover rebels. And particularly, I know you have some fascinating stories about some of them that contain information that is little known. So let's start with Adam Clayton Powell. Why is he heroic? Why is he a rebel and a crossover person?
Yeah, well, first of all, he was the first U.S. House of Representative who was Black from the Northeast, from Harlem. And so he went into Washington, it was a very violently segregated city when he arrived into the House of Representatives. And so he stood facing Southerners who did not want him there. And so he had to kind of map out his forte, and that was going to be human rights and civil rights. And he had to sit on the sidelines because the Southerners ruled the committees. But he finally got a chance when John F. Kennedy went into the White House, and then Adam Clayton Powell became chairman of the Education and Labor Committee. Those two committees had a lot to do with Black life in this country, with jobs and with schooling. And so he went around the country and he started holding hearings out in the street so that, and he could explain to America why segregation is wrong, why it's wrong to pay Black doctors, Black nurses, Black school teachers less than white school teachers, doctors, and nurses were getting. So Adam Clayton Powell, by virtue of being in the House of Representatives, became the great communicator to white America in this country in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. He started a great program that was called, still is called, Upward Bound. And that bill enabled young inner city kids, Black or young rural poor farm kids, it enabled them to go to a college campus during the summers in high school. They were first generation kids. And so they got an introduction to college by virtue of Adam Clayton Powell's genius. And I happened to have been one of those kids. And so I went to a small college during the summers of my 10th, 11th, and 12th grade year. And I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And so that link was very real to me. And he became a hero to me. And even before I wrote my first book, I had said to myself, I owe Adam Clayton Powell Jr. a debt. And I'm going to find a way in my life to repay that debt. And I carried a little picture of him in my wallet around with me for years.
That's great.
And, just made up my mind that someday I was going to write a book about his life. And so my first book was about a trip down the Mississippi River. And that was at the Boston Globe. And it was a travel book, although I loved the prose in the book. And I met with my editor, Peter Davidson, in Boston. And he asked me, he said, so what would you want to do next? What do you want to do next? And I was really excited that an editor thought that I had more than one book in me. And I told him, and I said, well, there's this member of Congress who died, and he was surrounded by shame, but he had a great epic life. And it seems like America has forgotten about it. And my editor said, who is that congressman? And I said, Adam Clayton Powell Jr.
Okay.
And my editor, I'll never forget it. He stood up, walked around from his desk, leaned down into me, and he screamed. He said, Will, nobody talks about Adam Clayton Powell Jr. anymore, which is why you're going to do the book. Excellent.
Let's move.
So that's how that book was born.
Let's move to Sugar Ray Robinson. And I'm going to tell you, Will, I've got the book behind me here. And I'm not a big fighting, the boxing ring means nothing to me. But because I became such a fan of your work when I read about Sammy Davis, I said, well, I'm going to dip my toe in the world of boxing. Oh my God, this is a book not just about boxing, but about social history. A man who was a bon vivant, a fashion icon, a cultural icon. Talk about Sugar Ray.
Yeah. The reason I picked the figures that I picked, because they frighten me. They really do. They scare me. And they scare me because they're high up on a mountain. And so many people in the country don't know about these figures as far as their written life. We go into most bookstores and you see 60 biographies or books about Thomas Jefferson, about Nelson Rockefeller, about Richard Nixon, about John F. Kennedy. But when I started my Adam Clayton Powell book, there was not a single biography about that man. When I started my Sugar Ray Robinson biography, there was not a major biography about that man. And I think that in the literary landscape needs to ask itself, why? And so some of that I knew I could swim into new waters when I chose these subjects. And so that meant something to me, that, that I almost had the whole field to myself. And the reason I wanted to write in that Sugar Ray Robinson book is because I had an uncle who was a boxer. And when I was little, my grandmother and I would sit next to each other, and she would start crying when she saw her son get hit on TV. And so there was some kind of mystery about why would anybody want to go into a boxing ring and get hit? I remember when I was like, I don't know, 14 years old, and I went down to a local recreation center and I got in a boxing ring and I got hit. And it was like the pain went from the top of my head all the way down to my ankle. I mean, I knew I never wanted to box. But what I could bring to this story is something different, because the way that book is written is not only about Sugar Ray Robinson, it's about his three best friends in life. And those friends were Lena Horne, Langston Hughes, and Miles Davis.
And who would have thought that? Who would have thought that?
Yeah, and so I often, when I'm starting a book, I'll often say, all right, when I come home at night and I open my door, is that someone who I want to see sitting on the couch with, who I want to hang out with? And I mean, who wouldn't want to hang out with Powell? Who wouldn't want to hang out and with the great Sugar Ray Robinson or Sammy Davis Jr.? And so these are people who, in their own way, were very joyful, larger than life, but they also had demons. And that's a great challenge for somebody who's a writer. Exactly. Plus, they were all warriors. All the people I've written about have been rebels, warriors. They fought against the system. This is a country, slavery, legal segregation, laws written on the book to stop Sammy Davis Jr., to stop Sugar Ray Robinson, to stop Adam Clayton Powell, to stop Thurgood Marshall. And so that's a great journey right there as a writer. I mean, that's struggle, that's strife, that's something. If you can go down deep into those stories, then you can lift something up that's quite inspiring.
And that's drama and that's conflict. I love the way when I was reading the book about Sammy Davis, I discovered that he had played a very influential role in the civil rights movement, which many people did not know at the time that he was, at its height. And for years, many people didn't know. Would you talk about that with Sammy? Because he's been denigrated, marginalized, but you showed his heroic side.
Yes. One quick thing, though, if I can go back to Sugar Ray Robinson, the great actor, David Oyelowo, who played Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, has just signed to play Sugar Ray Robinson in a movie that's based on my book.
Oh my gosh.
And I just saw the script recently.
You heard it here, everybody. You heard it here first. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so I'm very excited about that. As a matter of fact, I talked with David on the phone yesterday, and he's in training right now. He's going, he's skipping the rope and boxing, and so I'm very, very excited. He and I started talking about this shortly after Sweet Thunder came out. And the movie tentatively is going to be called Sweet Thunder.
Great.
So I'm very, very, very excited about that. But Sammy Sammy, at one point in the 50s, was the highest paid Black entertainer in this country. And so whenever Martin Luther King Jr. would be jailed, or students who were marching would be jailed, Martin Luther King Jr. would call Sidney Poitier or Harry Belafonte, and he would say 2 words: "Get Sammy," because he knew that Sammy Davis Jr., and at the drop of a pen, would send him $15,000 or $20,000 or $25,000 to get people bailed out of jail. And so that was a wonderful thing about Sammy, but he was twisted. He was in the twisted world because this country was twisted at the time, very twisted. And Sammy had to navigate his way through that world. He went to Canada when he was young, and he saw interracial relationships in Canada. And he, for some reason, thought he could transport that sentiment back here. And he found out very quickly that he couldn't. But, you know, there's a beautiful moment in the movie Selma as they're walking across the bridge at the end, and then you'll see a little real footage of Sammy Davis Jr. He's in a beautiful tweed coat, in a pork pie hat, and he's walking across the Selma Bridge. And somebody told me, who I interviewed for my Sammy Davis book, that he had tears in his eyes when he walked across that bridge. And so that was, you know, that was huge in the life of a guy whose mother left him when he was a kid. And, you know, he's so down, you know, he's so much deep in his heart, never felt that he was truly loved. I mean, and I think if you come up that way, where you're looking in the shadows for your mother and she's not there, because mothers will go into the jaws of a lion to get their kid. They will. I mean, I don't care if it's 20 lions on that hill. A mother's gonna walk up that hill and say, "All right, lion, let's go. That's my baby. I need my baby." And Sammy's mother didn't do that. And he was always haunted. And so, you know, but he never forgot his people. And that's a beautiful thing when you get right down to it. He never forgot his people. They often thought that he did, but in reality, they didn't. I interviewed Harry Belafonte for my Sammy Davis book. You know that voice that he has, that raspy voice. He said, "Whatever you do, you must tell the real story of Sammy Davis, because he never forgot Martin." And that was an important to me, and that was deep. That was a wonderful road that I had to go on and follow.
Right. You started with this kind of triumvirate of men, and then you wrote another book about a great heroic figure, Thurgood Marshall, specifically focusing on the summer of his nomination to the Supreme Court and how that changed America. And you discovered some really interesting things about Marshall.
One of the really, and I think, largest challenges of my writing life, because people in the country thought that they knew Thurgood Marshall. And when I talked to my editor, at first, he wasn't interested in me writing a book about Thurgood Marshall, and I asked him why. He said, "Because there's too much been written about Marshall." And then I said, "Well, how about this angle? there was not an opening on the Supreme Court when President Johnson summoned Thurgood and told him he was going to nominate him. But Johnson, being from Texas, called up Tom Clark, who was a justice on the court, and said, asked Tom Clark, told Tom Clark, he said, Tom, I want to name your son Ramsey to be my attorney general. But I want you, Tom, to go home and tell your wife that I can't name her son as my attorney general. And then the Associate Justice, Tom Clark, said, well, why not? And then Lyndon Johnson said, well, there'd be a conflict of interest because his son, because his father, you are sitting on the Supreme Court. And lo and behold, Tom, I know that you don't want to get off of the Supreme Court just for me and your son. So all I'm calling you today to tell you is go tell your wife why I can't nominate your son, Ramsey, to be my attorney general. Because I know that the Clark family loves the president, loves this country, but young Ramsey just is not going to have this great job. And Tom Clark came back the next day and said, well, Mr. President, actually, there are some other things in life that I'd rather be doing. I'd love to travel and go to Italy and have time. And so Tom Clark stepped down and Lyndon Johnson nominated Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court.
Master manipulator.
Yes.
Master manipulator.
What is very touching to me, on the day that Thurgood Marshall showed up at the White House to be told, there were 3 butlers on duty. And one of those butlers served him coffee and tea. And I found the records of who that was. And that butler was Mr. Allen, the man I wrote about. And that became the film. And so here's Mr. Allen from Virginia, born on a plantation. Life had crushed him until he found a way to get a nice job in the White House. And he's serving the man, Thurgood Marshall, who has spent his whole life trying to lift up people like Mr. Allen. That symmetry
exactly
is sometimes the kind of things you find as a writer if you just knock on enough doors and do enough research. And so anyway, with Thurgood in the confirmation hearing, I wanted to find out how it happened, how Lyndon Johnson convinced these Southerners to vote for Marshall. And so I needed to find as many archives, as many papers about the Southern senators as I could. One senator from Arkansas by the name of John McClellan was the fierce segregationist. He was there during Little Rock, and he hated Thurgood Marshall and didn't want Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. Of course, by the time I started doing the book, he was long dead, but I found a little college in Arkansas that had stored his archives. And so I called them and I said, hey, my name is Wil Haygood and I'm writing this book about Thurgood Marshall. And I want to come out there and look at the senators' papers. And they said, it's in his will that nobody can look at his papers until 50 years after his death. And then the secretary said, but my goodness, Mr. Haygood, you are calling 50 years and 4 days after the senator's death. So you can fly out here if you wish and look at the senator's papers. And so a couple of days later, I was on a plane and I flew out to Little Rock, rented a car and went to this little library in Arkansas. Now, the senator had been in the Senate for like more than 3 decades. And here I'm trying to find any piece of paper that references Thurgood Marshall.
Right.
And so, of course, that's going to be a whole lot of paperwork. And I knew I was going to be out there for 1 week and that there was no way humanly possible that I could look at everything. In the first day, and I was finding some things that were good. Second day, not so good. Third day, a good day. The fourth day, fairly good. But it was on the 5th day when I came across something that told me why the literary gods had chosen me to do this book. And it's a letter. And I got the letter right here. It's a letter that was written to Senator John McClellan. And it was written on July 19, 1967, right as Thurgood Marshall's hearings were happening. Now, nobody in all the books that had been written about Thurgood Marshall, at the most, there had been 2 pages given to his confirmation hearing. And so I knew that that was an unknown, untapped story.
Sure.
And this letter, written to the Honorable John McClellan, says, "Dear Sir, I am a resident of Arkansas and a law-abiding citizen who believes strongly in God, the United States Constitution, and justice for all. Recently, I read an article concerning remarks made by you and another senator about Thurgood Marshall and his efforts to become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Sir, I am a Negro, an American. I want you to know how I feel about Mr. Marshall's nomination. I'm sure that I can speak for all the Negroes in Arkansas. Mr. Marshall is just as qualified as any likely candidate that you know. It has been made quite clear which side you are on. We all know why you and the other Southern senators don't want him to be on the Supreme Court, and it's not because of the Constitution. Chances are that the nomination will be turned down, but we hope and pray that you will open up your heart and let all of the animosity and hatred out and let Mr. Marshall's record speak for itself. Color doesn't make the person senator, character makes the man. If he doesn't get the nomination, there will be others who will seek after the same opportunity when it presents them all. Somebody will get it. One of these days, the President of the United States will be a Negro. Sincerely yours, Barbara Ross." So in 1967, she predicted Obama.
Right.
And when I read this letter to my sister, Diane, she said, "Oh my God, Will, when the book comes out, then you have to find somebody in her family, one of her heirs, and tell them that this book, that this letter is going to be in your book." And so her address, whoever this lady was, she never got a response because it says file, no answer. Now, just so there are some young writing students out there who want to ask, how did Mr. Haygood, how did he get that letter? How was he able to take the letter out of the library? Well, it's because of you, your tax dollars. We all pay taxes, and so we are allowed to Xerox in material from these archival libraries. And so, but that was a great idea of what my sister said, see if I can find somebody who knew her. And her address is on here, Texarkana, Arkansas. I called the city clerk in Texarkana and said, "Hey, my name is Wil Haygood. I'm trying to find any relatives of a lady who used to live there named Barbara Ross, because I've tracked down a letter of hers that I'm going to use in this book." And the city clerk had never heard of this person or her family, didn't know anybody, but she asked me to leave my phone number with her, and I did. About 10 days later, she calls back and leaves a message on my phone here in Washington and says, "Will, here's a number and that you should call." And that's it. I'm thinking it's a number back to her office, but I dialed the number and a voice says, hello. And I said, hi, my name is Wil Haygood. I'm a writer. I've just finished this book about Thurgood Marshall, and I'm trying to find any relative of a lady by the name of Barbara Ross, because I've used her letter that she wrote to Senator John McClellan back in 1967. Are you able to help me? And the lady said, my name is Barbara Ross. And I said, oh my goodness, were you named after her or something? And she said, sweetie, I was home from college that summer, and I was listening to the radio, and I heard that my senator was giving Thurgood Marshall a hard time. And I told my dad I wanted to write a letter. And my dad said, no way, it'll get the family in trouble. So my dad went off to do his farm chores. And my mother said, your father just bought you a manual typewriter last Christmas. Go upstairs, write your letter, and I'll go into town and mail it for you. And I'm sitting and I'm getting chills. I mean, it's hard to think that I'm talking to somebody whose letter I just happened to have found. And so I have the address here, which is 2103 Delaware Street. So I said, because I had to kind of test her, I wanted to give her a little test just to make sure that I'm talking to the right person. I said, do you remember, Miss Ross, where you were living at in the summer of 1967? And she said, honey, of course. I was living at 2103 Delaware Street with mom and dad. And I said, oh my God. I said, Mrs. Ross. And I said, I know that you never got a response from your letter. And I'm sorry about that. My government owed you a response, but you never got one. And I said, you're going to get one though in this book, because, and I'm going to write the story of how you came to write that letter. And she asked me, and if I was pulling her leg, I said, no, ma'am, I'm not. And so she became a school teacher, you know, and we were on the phone for another, 15 minutes. And she asked me some things about my life, and I told her. And just before she hung up, she said, now, what was it like working with Oprah Winfrey on that movie?
Yeah, the really important question, the most important question is, what was it like working with Oprah Winfrey?
Yeah.
Thank you, Wil. That somebody put in the chat room, you never fail to amaze me. I think I second that motion. At this point, I want to just take a moment to thank everybody who's joining us on Facebook. Thank you on Zoom. You will be getting information on Facebook through the comments section and in the chat room on Zoom about how to purchase Wil's new book, forthcoming in the fall, Colorization, as well as how to sign up to be on my list to get invitations to future presentations. At this point, Wil, I want to move to Colorization, the new book, which is fascinating, and talk about how the genesis of that book, how you came to be writing it.
I was actually on the set in New Orleans when we were making The Butler, and there were like 7 Oscar winners walking around. There were 7 Oscar winners on that movie. And I remember standing around as they were setting up a scene, and I just said out into open air, and I just said, oh my goodness, somebody really needs to write a story about this, a book about Blacks in movies and how far we've come. And the actor Terrence Howard was standing a few feet from me, and he walked over to me and he pointed his fingers at me. Terrence Howard from The Best Man, he pointed his finger at me and he said, Wil, you're the writer. You ought to write it. And so, you know, in subsequent years, I started thinking about this book about cinema, Blacks, because that's a great story. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Eartha Kitt, Lena Horne, Hazel Scott. I mean, you know, and you got all of these people, you know, they not only had to fight their way into Hollywood, they had to fight their way to get decent scripts. They had to fight their way to get decent salaries for the roles. They had to fight the stereotyping of Black folk in this country. And so it just became a great big subject, sort of scary too. And because there's a lot of hills that you have to climb. And, you know, so that's how that movie was born. And I didn't just want to write a book about the joys of cinema, you know, who wins the Oscar, that, you know, and all that. But in the middle of writing this book, you had in the Oscar So White movement. Right. And so it just lifted the story up even higher. And I think people are going to be surprised at some of the things that I found out about Black struggle in Hollywood. It's just been a very wonderful book to have worked on these past 4 years.
Now you said, you told me that when you approached your editor with the idea you wanted to focus on a decade, he said, well, why not do a century of Black films? And you've also said you cannot understand America if you don't understand Black cinema. So talk a little bit about that. You can't understand America unless you understand Black cinema.
Yeah. It's true that for the most part, whites don't interact with Blacks in this country on so many levels, 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And you have neighborhood segregation. And so many whites will judge Blacks from the Blacks that they've seen in movies.
Yes.
Yes. And I mean, that becomes the reference point. There was a stretch when there were very few Blacks in leading roles in cinema after the wave of the 60s and then the Blaxploitation. And then all of a sudden there was a slowing down of Blacks on screen. And then Roots hit, Alex Haley's Roots. But that was offered to the motion pictures first. But the Hollywood studios were nervous and said, oh, no, we aren't going down that road. That slavery, nah, people won't want to go to the theaters to see what we did to Black folk. No. And so it became a sensation. Roots did, 1976, 1977. It became a sensation. There had never been so much water cooler conversation about Blacks in the history of this country as there was after Roots came on TV. And so cinema really speaks to the country, because one night a week, on that Friday night or that Saturday night or that Sunday afternoon, everybody has a conversation and that they can link on to.
Right.
Oh man, and I just saw a patch of blue over the weekend. It's about this guy who's Black and this woman who's blind, and he meets her in a park and he becomes a good friend of hers, but she can't see him and she doesn't know that he's Black. But as soon as her mother finds out, her mother goes into an uproar about, hey, you can't see, sweetie, but that's a black man that you've been hanging out with, and you better stop it right now. And gee, I mean, speaking of Sidney Poitier, he did Paris Blues.
Right.
Sidney Poitier, Diane Curl,
Right.
Paul Newman, and Joanne Woodward. Well, the script had it that they wanted a mixed couple. So they wanted Paul Newman and Diane Curl and Sidney Poitier and Joanne Woodward.
Okay.
And so when the script writer turned that in, and the studio said, oh, hell no. No. That'd get us in a whole lot of trouble. No. Let's keep this simple. Sidney and Diane and Joanne and Paul, white, black. And, you know, those stories are wonderful stories to ferret out and to tell those kinds of stories. I mean, you know, that's one thing.
The films.
Yeah. Excuse me. Say what? What'd you say?
Stories behind the films.
Yes, the stories behind the films, the writers, you know, the screenwriters, why certain people wanted to do this one, you know, why certain people wanted to do this movie, you know. One of my great interviews, I flew down to Atlanta to spend 2 days with Louis Gossett Jr., Oscar winner. Now he goes back to A Raisin in the Sun on Broadway.
He goes way
and he did the movie as well. And I mean, he knew Paul Robeson, he knew James Edwards, James Edwards was Sidney Poitier before Sidney Poitier. But a whole lot of people, white and black, do not know about him. And he got in trouble because he was dating white actresses in Hollywood. It's a great story. And that story is told in this book. And it, you know, it's like 100 years, 1915 to 2020. And so, I mean, it's like 100 plus, but it's a big century swath of this nation's history. And behind every big movie, something's going on the street in this country. And I tell that story too. Most film books are just about the films, and they stop right there. But if you walk down off of the 60-foot screen out the doors of that theater, and you can tell what's going on simultaneously, then it becomes a very rich saga, a very rich story about this country. I mean, look what happened. Oscar So White, George Floyd. I mean, look what happened. I mean, after George Floyd, actors got involved and movie directors got involved, and Hollywood has never been involved with social activism the way it is now. And it's been very remarkable to see that. Well,
Wil, this has been a great introduction to what is a fascinating book. I have to ask you, as we conclude, to give some advice to the writers in the audience. Many of the people in this audience are people who are aspiring writers, emerging writers. What's your best advice, especially for Black writers, writers who've been told that their stories, even today, are still told that their stories, you know, possibly won't sell. And you teach, you've taught at the Hurston Wright Foundation Summer Writers Workshop, and you're a master teacher. You teach with rigor and compassion. So what's your best advice to people who want to become writers?
Mm-hmm. You know, my writing life was born a failure. It was just born straight up a failure. In college, I majored in city planning, and I liked literature though, and I liked writing. But I went to New York City and got a job as a low-level executive at Macy's department store, and I was fired about a year and a half after that. I mean, I was just terrible at it. And I said at the age of 25, I said, Will, it's time to focus now. It's time to like sink or swim, focus your life on something that you would do if you weren't paid, something that you would find joy from, right, even if you weren't paid a dime. And I said, that's writing. I like to write. So I got to start writing editors around the country and get a job on newspapers. And then I'll see what happens. And that's what I did. I wrote a letter to an editor in Charleston, West Virginia, and he hired me. I was a low-level editor, a copy editor on the newspaper, worked at nights. You know, that was part of my struggle. And then I got another job after a year and a half on that paper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I became a full-time staff writer on that paper. And then I went to the Boston Globe, started writing books, and then the Washington Post. And so I just stuck to my, I just stuck to my dream. Every step of the way, there was always somebody who would say, oh, I don't think that you'll be able to become a national reporter. Oh, why not? You know, that was always my answer. Who told you that about me? Who told you that Wil Haygood can't become a national writer at the Boston Globe? So I did. Exactly. And then I became a foreign correspondent. Then I came here to the Washington Post. I was lucky enough to have editors like Deborah Hurd and Steve Reese, people who without a doubt would send me anywhere in the country at a moment's notice. Without a doubt, any kind of story, they would, boom, send me out there. And I think that if you are very committed to what you do, that other people are going to feel that and see that light in you. They will see it. Writing is hard, it's lonely, and all that kind of stuff. But it's also, you know, it can also be very joyful if that is what you want to do. And this is a very exciting time in this country to be a writer, because so much is going on, which means that so much needs to be explained by us writers out here. I mean, this is a time that calls for writers. It calls for passion. It calls for the written word. It calls for essays and books and articles to explain not only history, you know, but explain how did this country get to a moment like the 6th of January, 2021. Mm-hmm. People are going to want to know, where did that come from? How did that erupt? The seeds have always been there. Sammy Davis Jr. saw those seeds. Harry Belafonte saw those seeds. Eartha Kitt saw those seeds. They had to walk through the weeds of all that stuff, and they did, and they were still successful.
Wil, you are the man. Thank you so much for a marvelous celebration of Black history, Black heroes, and Black writers. And we're all looking forward to the new book, Colorization, 100 Years of Black Films in a White World. And I just thank you so much. You're a great storyteller on the page, and you're a great storyteller orally. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You are a force of nature, and it's been an honor to be on your show.
And I've been so gratified that the Hurston Wright Foundation, which I co-founded, has
Yep.
honored your work. We honored the Sammy Davis Jr. book with the Legacy Award. We've been graced by having you teach in our workshops, and it's just wonderful. And I'm so happy for all of the, you're just insatiable, you're prolific, and we're all gonna look forward to that film, Sweet Thunder. And I wanna thank, at this point, I wanna thank Ramona Foster, my tech person who helped us get
Thank you, Ramona.
for some initial glitches, but we're all living in this Zoom world, so we all have patience. Once again, check the chat room, check the comment section for information on purchasing, pre-ordering Wil's new book, and signing up to get on my listserv. Next month, March, is Women's History Month, and I will be interviewing Sadiqa Johnson, the author of the new book, Yellow Wife, as part of the DC Public Library's March programming. And also on March 20th, I will be hosting a Black Women Writers Showcase. I'll be inviting some of my new and old Black women writing friends to celebrate the women who made them writers, their favorite Black women writers, and their new projects. So I want to thank all of you, all 99 plus of you on Zoom and the rest of you on Facebook, for joining me today for this creative conversation. Have a good rest of your weekend. Happy
Thank you.
Black History Month. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.